A mountain man bought a cheap cabin, but then his dog discovered why it was abandoned. The wind howls through broken shutters. The cabin creaks like it's breathing. By the fire, the man thinks he's found peace until his dog begins growling. At the cellar door, what lies beneath the floorboards isn't just dust and old jars. It's a secret that drove the last family away in terror. And when a desperate woman and her little brother arrive at the cabin's door, claiming it as their own, the truth only grows darker. Was this cabin ever his, or has he walked into a fight far bigger than he ever imagined? The sheriff wants it. The railroad wants it. And the dog won't stop digging. What was hidden in this cabin? And will the truth cost them their lives or give them a chance at redemption? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Brandon Boone pulled his horse's reins, slowing to a stop on the muddy main street of Sterling Junction. After 6 months alone in the high mountain passes, the sight of wooden buildings and pipe smoke rising from tin chimneys stirred something in his chest. The loneliness of those long winter nights had worn him down like water on stone. He dismounted stiffly, his boots squelching in the spring mud. His faithful hound Brindle padded alongside as Brandon led his horse to the hitching post. The dog's tail wagged at the new smells of civilization, fresh bread from the mercantile, wood smoke, and the iron tang of the railroad. Reckon it's time. We found ourselves a real home, boy, Brandon said quietly, scratching behind Brindle's ears. The dog looked up at him with knowing brown eyes. The land office sat between the telegraph station and the bank, its weathered sign creaking in the breeze. Inside, coal oil lamps cast yellow light on maps tacked to the walls. A well-dressed agent looked up from his desk, his smile spreading quick as spilled molasses. "Welcome, friend. Looking to stake a claim?" The agent's voice was smooth as creek. "Stones." Brandon nodded, running calloused fingers through his beard. "Got some savings from trapping. Time to put down roots." The agent rifled through papers on his desk. "As it happens, I have just the thing. Mountain cabin, good water rights. Previous owner left sudden-like. Offering it at a special price today. Only." Brandon studied the property description, something tugging at the back of his mind about the low price. At the thought of 4 solid walls and a roof overhead after so many nights under stars proved too tempting. A clerk sorting mail in the corner caught Brandon's eye. "Sir," the older man said softly, "might want to know. Nobody seems to stay long up there." The agent shot the clerk a sharp look. "Pay him no mind. Now then, shall we draw up the deed?" Brandon hesitated, but the ache for home won out. He counted out his savings, the price of 6 months' worth of beaver pelts, and signed his name in careful letters. The narrow wagon trail switchbacked up the mountainside, winding through stands of aspen just showing spring buds. Brandon led, his horse carefully around the hairpin turns as afternoon shadows lengthened. Brindle trotted ahead, nose to the ground. They reached the cabin at dusk. Brandon's heart sank a bit at the sight. Logs gray with age, roof sagging in the middle, shutters hanging crooked. But the stone chimney looked solid enough. This could be home with some work. He unsaddled his horse in the lean-to stable, then carried his gear inside. The cabin was a single room with a cook stove, rough table, and rope bed. Dust lay thick on everything. Wind whistled through gaps in the chinking, making the shutters bang. Brindle prowled the corners, hackles raised. The dog's behavior was odd. Usually he settled right into new places. But Brandon was too tired to worry about it. He told himself the dog just needed time to adjust. He got a fire going in the stove and set a pot of beans to cook. The familiar tasks helped settle his mind. As darkness gathered outside, he lit the coal oil lamp he'd bought in town. Its yellow glow made the cabin feel almost cozy. Brandon sat at the table with his tin plate, listening to the wind in the pines. Though the cabin needed work, satisfaction spread through his chest. After years of wandering, he finally had a place to call his own. A low growl broke into his thoughts. Brindle stood rigid, staring at something in the floor. Brandon lifted the lamp, revealing a trapdoor he hadn't noticed before. The dog's growl deepened. "Just a root cellar, boy," Brandon said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. The clerk's warning echoed in his mind. Nobody stays long up there. Brindle wouldn't settle. He kept his eyes fixed on the trapdoor, growling steadily. The sound raised the hair on Brandon's neck, though he told himself he was being foolish. Still, he found himself avoiding that corner of the cabin as he ready for bed. The lamp's flame painted strange shadows on the log walls. Brandon lay on the rope bed, listening to the wind moan through the gaps and Brindle's occasional growls. Sleep was a long time coming that first night in his new home. Morning light filtered through the cabin's gaps, casting thin beams across the dusty floor. Brandon rose early, his muscles stiff from the unfamiliar bed. Outside, frost still gripped the ground, though spring sun promised to soften it by midday. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, determined to tackle the cabin's most pressing needs. The roof couldn't wait. A steady drip near the stove threatened his small store of dry firewood. Brindle usually followed him everywhere, but today the dog planted himself by the cold hearth, his eyes never leaving the trapdoor. "Suit yourself, boy," Brandon muttered, gathering his tools. He climbed carefully onto the roof, testing each step on the weathered shakes. A section near the chimney had rotted clear through, explaining the leak. Brandon worked steadily, replacing damaged shakes with spare ones he'd found in the lean-to. The familiar work of his hands helped quiet his mind, though he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut since yesterday. By mid-morning, the roof was patched. Brandon's next task was water. He grabbed 2 wooden buckets and headed down to the creek he'd spotted yesterday. The path was steep but clear. Previous residents had worn it well. The creek ran swift with snowmelt, its edges still rimmed with ice. He had to break through the frozen crust to fill his buckets. When Brandon returned, Brindle hadn't moved from his post. The dog's behavior was starting to wear on him. He'd never seen his companion so fixated, so unwilling to leave a spot. As evening approached, Brandon could no longer ignore the trapdoor. The dog's vigilance and his own curiosity demanded answers. He lit a fresh lamp and set it on the floor, beside the iron ring that served as a handle. "All right, boy, let's see what's got you so worked up." The hinges protested with a screech that set his teeth on edge. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying the musty smell of earth and something else, a sour note that made him wrinkle his nose. Brandon held the lamp out over the opening, revealing a short ladder leading down into darkness. Brindle whined but stayed back as Brandon descended. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, its walls cut straight into the hard mountain soil. The lamp's light caught rows of shelves along one wall, lined with dusty jars. Brandon stepped closer, examining them. Most held spoiled preserves, fruit and vegetables gone dark with age. Others contained dried beans, their contents still good. Despite the years, the air felt heavy down here, pressed close by the earth above. Brandon's boot caught something half buried in the dirt floor. He crouched down, brushing away soil to reveal a small leather shoe. A child's shoe, its leather cracked and stained. His throat tightened at the sight. What story lay behind this? Lonely little boot? A frantic scratching sound made him turn. Brindle had followed him down and was attacking a board near the floor, his claws tearing at rotted wood. Before Brandon could stop him, the board splintered and broke loose. Behind it gaped another space, a hidden compartment. Brandon lifted his lamp higher. More shelves lined this secret room, though they stood empty now. Dust-free circles showed where jars had once sat. The setup spoke of preparation. Someone had planned for a long stay, hiding away extra supplies. But why? And what had happened to drive them away, leaving even a child's shoe behind? He climbed back up the ladder slowly, his mind troubled by questions. The cabin felt different now, weighted with untold stories. As he closed the trapdoor, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that these walls had witnessed grief. Real suffering had happened here. He felt it in his bones. That night, he lay awake in his bed, listening to the wind's mournful song through the pine boughs. Brindle had finally left his post by the trapdoor, but the dog's rest was uneasy, punctuated by small whimpers. Brandon stared at the ceiling, wondering about the family who had stocked those shelves and hidden extra supplies. Had they been preparing for a harsh winter? Running from something? And where were they now? The child's shoe haunted him most. Such a small thing to carry such heavy meaning. Tomorrow he would look more carefully through the cellar, search for more clues. But for now, sleep eluded him as his mind churned with possibilities. The cabin held secrets, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know them all. Dawn painted the mountain. Peaks in soft rose when Brandon saddled his horse. The cabin's mysteries had stolen his sleep, leaving him bleary-eyed and unsettled. His supply list weighed heavy in his pocket. Flour, lamp oil, nails, and other necessities to make the place livable. Brindle trotted alongside as they descended the narrow trail. The morning air bit sharp and clean, but Brandon barely noticed. His mind still dwelling on that small shoe buried in the cellar dirt. The rail town looked different in morning light, less welcoming than when he'd signed those papers. Folks stopped their conversations as he rode past, eyes following him with strange expressions. He tied his horse outside the mercantile and pushed through the wooden doors. Bell jingling overhead. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans and leather. Brandon had barely picked up a basket when he caught fragments of whispered conversations. "That's him. Bought the ghost cabin up yonder. Poor soul won't last a month. Just like the mothers." Brandon kept his eyes on his task, methodically filling his basket. Flour, coffee, beans. The leather of his boots creaked against the plank floor as he moved down the aisles. Lamp oil, matches, nails. Each item clicked against the others with familiar purpose. At the counter, the shopkeeper, a gray-haired man with wire spectacles, rang up his purchases. The older man's hands paused over the receipt book. "Tell you what, mister," he said quietly. "I'll take 15% off the total, seeing as where you're staying and all." Brandon met the man's pitying gaze steadily. "Much obliged," he said stiffly, "but I'll pay full price." Outside, he was loading supplies onto his packed mule when a weathered rancher spat tobacco juice near his boots. "Last family up there?" the man drawled. "Just vanished. Clean disappeared one winter night. Left everything behind, they did." Brandon tightened the mule's straps without responding. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the best answer. Once the supplies were secured, he mounted up and headed back toward the cabin, letting his horse pick its way carefully along the trail. The sun hung low by the time the cabin came into view. Brandon had just dismounted when Brindle's bark shattered the evening quiet. The dog stood rigid, hackles raised, facing the thick stand of pines that crowded the eastern edge of the clearing. Brandon's rifle was in his hands, before he consciously reached for it. He scanned the tree line, looking for movement, listening for anything out of place. But there was only the wind in the branches and Brindle's increasingly frantic barking. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though his own nerves hummed with tension. After a long moment, he lowered the rifle and turned to unloading his supplies. Inside, he built up the fire and set a pot of beans to simmer. The familiar routine helped settle his mind, though Brindle remained restless, pacing between windows. Darkness gathered quickly outside, pressing against the glass. The sound came just as he was stirring the pot. Careful footsteps on the packed earth outside. Brandon moved silently to extinguish the lamp, then drew his revolver. He positioned himself beside the door, listening intently. A knock came, soft but firm. Brandon's finger rested beside the trigger as he counted heartbeats. Another knock, more insistent. He lifted the latch with his free hand and pulled the door open, raising his lantern high. The light revealed two figures huddled against the cold, a young woman and a boy of perhaps 10 years. Their clothes were trail-worn but clean, their dark eyes reflecting the lantern's flame. The woman spoke first, her voice clear despite her obvious exhaustion. "I am Chloe," she said, gesturing to herself, then to the boy. "This is my brother. We have walked far today." Brandon noted how she positioned herself slightly in front of the boy, protective. Her English was careful, deliberate. "This cabin," she continued, meeting his gaze directly. "It belonged to our family." The boy pressed closer to his sister, watching Brandon with a mixture of wariness and hope. In the lantern light, their breaths formed small clouds in the cold air. Brandon looked at them for a long moment, thinking of the child's shoe in the cellar, of the hidden compartment stocked for hard times. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Brindle, who had been watching intently from behind Brandon's legs, slowly wagged his tail. Brandon stepped back from the doorway, lowering his revolver. "Come in," he said gruffly, fire still warm. Chloe guided her brother inside with a gentle hand on his shoulder. They moved cautiously, like wild creatures uncertain of shelter. The boy's eyes darted around the cabin, settling on the pot of beans still simmering over the hearth. "Sit," Brandon said, gesturing to the rough-hewn chairs. "I reckon you could use something hot to eat." As he ladled beans into tin bowls, Chloe sat straight backed in her chair, her brother pressed close beside her. The firelight cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting the exhaustion in their features. "You said this was your family's cabin," Brandon prompted. Setting the bowls before them, Chloe nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm bowl. "My father built it with his own hands before I was born. We lived here in peace for many years." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Then the settlers came. They wanted the water rights, the grazing land. "The sheriff," her voice hardened. "He said we had no legal claim, said we were squatters on railroad land." Brandon settled into his own chair, studying them. The boy ate quickly, hunger overcoming caution, while Chloe took smaller, measured bites. Her words stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He'd seen enough frontier justice to know how the law could bend when money spoke loud enough. "That's quite a claim," he said carefully. "I bought this place legal and proper." "Yes," Chloe agreed. "But from those who stole it first." She met his gaze steadily. "Tomorrow, I will show you proof." They finished their meal in silence. Brandon offered them blankets and his own bedroll, taking the hard floor for himself. As he lay there, listening to their quiet breathing, he wondered what proof she could possibly have that would matter against a signed deed. Morning came crisp and clear. After a breakfast of coffee and cornbread, Chloe led them to the old barn. The structure leaned slightly, its weathered boards gray with age. Her brother, who Brandon learned was called Nate, trotted alongside Brindle, the dog matching the boy's pace with surprising gentleness. "Here," Chloe said, stopping at the barn's foundation. She brushed away years of accumulated debris from one of the corner posts. There, carved deep into the wood, was a symbol, flowing lines forming what looked like mountains meeting water. "Our family mark," she explained. "My father carved it into every building he made, asking the creators' blessing." Her fingers traced the weathered grooves. "This was our home." Brandon knelt to examine the carving more closely. The cuts rolled, the edges softened by time and weather. This was no fresh mark made to support a tale. A burst of laughter made him look up. Nate was playing with Brindle, tossing a stick that the dog eagerly retrieved. The boy's face had transformed, joy breaking through his wariness like sun through clouds. Brindle pranced around him, tail wagging furiously, all his earlier unease forgotten. Brandon stood slowly, dust coating his knees. The deed in his saddlebag held the law's authority, but the truth carved in this post spoke of a different kind of right. The conflict twisted in his gut like a rope pulled two ways dot as evening approached. They gathered again around the fire. Brandon had spent the day splitting wood, trying to work out his thoughts through physical labor. Chloe had somehow turned his meager supplies into a proper meal, stretching the beans with foraged herbs and wild onions. Before they ate, Chloe bowed her head. "Creator God," she began in English, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for this food, for shelter from the cold." She continued in her native tongue, the words flowing like water over stones. Brandon didn't understand them, but their meaning seemed to reach beyond language. "Help us heal the wounds of the past," she finished in English. "Show us the path to peace." Brandon found himself bowing his head, her words touching something deep within him. He thought of his own wounds, the loss of his wife, the lonely years that followed. Perhaps healing could come in unexpected ways. When he looked up, he caught Nate watching him intently. The boy's eyes held questions Brandon wasn't sure he could answer. Across the fire, Chloe's face remained serene, but he saw the hope she tried to hide. The cabin suddenly felt different, not just his purchased property, but a place carrying stories he hadn't known to look for. The legal paper in his saddlebag seemed thinner somehow, weighed against the history carved in barn posts and hidden. In root cellars, they ate together in companionable silence. While outside, the wind whispered through pine needles, and Brindle kept watch from the porch. His loyalty now extended to include their unexpected guests. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Brandon's axe split another log. The steady rhythm of his work matched the beating of his heart. Strike, split, stack. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, watching Chloe through the cabin's open door. She sat by the window, needle flashing as she mended the tattered curtains. She had found in a trunk near the porch. Nate crouched beside Brindle, sneaking the dog bits of dried beef when he thought no one was looking. The hound's tail wagged with each offering, his earlier unease forgotten in the light of day. "Best not spoil him too much," Brandon called out, but he couldn't help smiling at the pair. The boy looked up, grinning, and slipped Brindle another morsel. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider approached along the narrow trail, one of the neighboring ranchers Brandon had seen in town. The man reined his horse to a stop, eyes narrowing as he spotted Chloe through the window. His face twisted with disgust, and he spat deliberately into the dust before wheeling his horse around and galloping away. Brandon's grip tightened on the axe handle. Nate had pressed himself against Brindle, small fingers buried in the dog's fur. Inside, Chloe continued her sewing, but her shoulders had stiffened. Later, Brandon found Chloe at the creek, filling water buckets. The afternoon sun filtered through the pines, dappling the ground around her. It cleared his throat to announce his presence. "That fellow who rode by," he said, taking one of the heavy buckets. "He won't be the last. Folks in town, they got their minds set certain ways." Chloe straightened, meeting his gaze. "We know their ways," she said quietly. "My father taught us to pray for peace with our neighbors, not war. Even when they drove us out, he would not curse them." She dipped the other bucket into the creek's clear water. "Hatred is a heavy burden to carry." Brandon nodded slowly, understanding more than he could say. They walked back to the cabin together, the water sloshing gently in their buckets. The day mellowed into evening, and savory smells filled the cabin. Chloe had prepared venison stew, using meat Brandon had stored and herbs she had gathered. The curtains, now mended, hung straight and clean in the windows. Nate had swept the floor without being asked, and even arranged Brandon's few books neatly. On their shelf dot, as they sat down to eat, Brandon looked around the cabin. Something had changed in just these few days. The spaces that had felt empty now felt full. The silence that had pressed in on him had been replaced by the quiet sounds of shared living. The scrape of spoons in bowls, the crackle of the fire, Nate's soft humming as he fed Brindle bits of meat under the table. "Place feels different," Brandon said at last, surprising himself by speaking the thought aloud. Warmer, somehow. Chloe's eyes met his across the table, understanding in their depths. "A home needs more than walls and a roof," she said softly. "It needs life within it." Brandon nodded, unable to find words for how right she was. The cabin had been just shelter before. Now it felt like it might become something more. The peaceful. Moments shattered as Brindle suddenly raised his head, hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he turned toward the cellar door. The dog's eyes fixed on the wooden trapdoor. His body tense. Brandon rose, checking that his revolver was secure in its holster. He lit a lantern and approached the cellar door, while Chloe drew Nate close to her side. The trapdoor creaked as Brandon lifted it, holding the lantern high to illuminate the earthen walls below. Nothing seemed disturbed. The shelves still held their dusty jars. The dirt floor showed no new tracks. Yet the air felt thick with watchfulness, as if unseen eyes followed his movements. Brindle's growl continued, a steady warning in the silence. Brandon descended the ladder, lantern casting jumping shadows. He checked every corner, finding nothing but his own footprints from his previous inspection. Still, the hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt relief when he climbed back into the warmth of the cabin's main room. "Nothing there," he reported, closing the trapdoor firmly. But Brindle maintained his vigil, ears forward, eyes fixed on the floor. The dog's unease spread through the cabin like a chill draft, dimming the comfort they had found in each other's company. Chloe tucked Nate into his bedroll near the fire, singing softly to him in her native tongue until his eyes drifted closed. Brandon added wood to the fire, its light pushing back the shadows. But Brindle would not settle, pacing between the cellar door and his master, his normal good nature replaced by watchful tension. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountain cabin. Brandon stood in the yard, studying the roof where several shingles had worked loose during winter storms. He'd picked up fresh cedar shakes in town, and now was as good a time as any to make repairs. "I can help," Chloe offered, coming to stand beside him. She pointed to where water damage had darkened the wood. "My father taught me how." Brandon nodded, surprised but pleased. Together they gathered tools and climbed a sturdy ladder he'd propped against the eaves. The morning air held a bite, but work soon warmed them. Chloe proved skilled with hammer and nails, her movements sure as they replaced damaged shingles below. Nate wandered the edge of the clearing with Brindle, gathering fallen branches for kindling. The boy chatted happily to the dog in a mix of English and Apache, his small arms full of dry twigs. Brindle stayed close, tail wagging as he helped the child search through the underbrush. As the sun climbed toward noon, Brandon climbed down from the roof and checked his pocket watch. "Best get cleaned up," he said. "Church starts at 1 o'clock. Chloe paused in her work, surprise crossing her features. "Church?" "Reckon it's time folks see us as family," Brandon said firmly. "All of us together." They washed up and put on their best clothes. Brandon had few fancy things, but he brushed his coat and polished his boots. Chloe wore a simple calico dress, her long black hair neatly braided. She helped Nate into his cleanest shirt, smoothing the worn fabric with gentle hands. The church bell was ringing as they rode into town. Brandon on his horse with Nate seated before him, Chloe on the gentle mare he'd borrowed from a neighbor. Heads turned as they dismounted, whispers following them up the wooden steps. Inside, the small church fell silent as Brandon led Chloe and Nate to a pew near the middle. He sat proudly beside them, aware of the stares but refusing to acknowledge. Then, the silence stretched until the organist began playing, the familiar notes of Amazing Grace filling the space. During the hymns, Brandon's deep voice joined Chloe's clear tones, while Nate followed along in the hymnal, finger tracing each word. Some congregants still whispered behind raised hands, but others offered cautious nods of greeting. The pastor, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, rose to deliver his sermon. His text was from the Gospel of Matthew, speaking of mercy and welcoming strangers. Though he never looked directly at Brandon's pew, his words about Christian hospitality rang clear as chapel bells after the service. Brandon proudly introduced Chloe to those who approached. Several women complimented her singing voice, and one elderly deacon welcomed them warmly. But others hurried past, avoiding eye contact. The sheriff stood by the door, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. His eyes held contempt as he watched them, one hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. Brandon met his gaze steadily, positioning himself between the lawman and Chloe. They rode home as sunset painted the mountains gold. Brandon felt a deep satisfaction, knowing he declared his choice before God and the whole town. Let them whisper. He knew in his heart this was right. Back at the cabin, Chloe prepared a simple supper while Brandon tended to the horses. Through the window, he could see Nate already asleep by the fire, worn out from the day's events. Brindle lay beside the boy, head on paws but eyes alert, ever watchful. Brandon paused before entering, studying the cabin in the fading light. Fresh shingles gleamed on the roof, smoke curled from the chimney, and warm lamplight spilled from the windows. For the first time since buying the place, he felt not just ownership, but belonging. Perhaps this wasn't just shelter anymore, but the beginnings of a true home. "Supper's ready?" Chloe called softly from the doorway. Brandon nodded, taking one last look at the peaceful scene. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. He climbed the porch steps, leaving his boots by the door, and stepped into the warmth of his family's evening meal. Winter settled over the mountain like a heavy blanket, bringing short days and long nights. Frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows each morning, and smoke curled steadily from the chimney as Chloe kept the hearth fire burning. Their routine fell into an easy rhythm, each day marked by honest work and simple pleasures. Brandon rose before dawn to haul water from the creek, breaking through thin ice to fill the wooden buckets. The cold bit at his hands, but the sight of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney warmed something deep in his chest. Inside, he knew Chloe would be stirring cornmeal mush for breakfast, while Nate helped feed kindling to the stove. On clear days, Brandon took the boy hunting, teaching him to track rabbits through the snow. Nate proved a quick study, his eyes sharp as he followed tiny prints across white drifts. Brindle trotted alongside them, nose to the ground, occasionally flushing game from beneath snow-laden bushes. "Keep your movements slow," Brandon instructed, showing Nate how to set snares. "With careful hands. Like this, see? The rabbit won't notice till it's too late." The boy nodded earnestly, his small fingers mimicking Brandon's motions. When they caught their first rabbit together, Nate's face lit up with pride. That evening, Chloe prepared it in a rich stew, and Brandon caught himself smiling at the boys' excited retelling of their hunt. Between hunting trips, Brandon taught Nate to whittle. They sat on the porch, wrapped in warm blankets, while Brandon showed him how to shape wood into simple toys. The boy's first attempt at a horse was rough but recognizable, and Brandon displayed it proudly on the mantel inside. Chloe brought warmth to the cabin in countless ways. She hummed old songs while mending clothes or cooking, her voice blending with the crack of the fire. She taught Nate to read from an old Bible, pointing out words while Brandon listened from his chair, finding peace in their quiet lessons. One evening, as Brandon checked the cellar for any vegetables they might have missed, Brindle began scratching frantically at a corner. The dog's claws revealed another loose board, different from the one they'd found earlier. Brandon pried it free, discovering a tin box wrapped carefully in oilskin. "What is it?" Nate asked, peering down the cellar stairs. "Just some old papers," Brandon replied, tucking the box under his arm. He would examine them later, when the children slept. For now, the smell of cornbread called them to supper. That night, they gathered around the table, warm light from the oil lamp casting friendly shadows. Nate told a story about Brindle chasing his own tail, and their laughter filled the cabin. Brandon watched Chloe wipe tears of mirth from her eyes, and his heart swelled. It felt right, like family should. But morning brought trouble riding up their trail. Brandon spotted them through the frost-touched window, the sheriff and 2 deputies, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the riders and his door. "Morning, Boone," the sheriff called, reining his horse to a stop. His badge caught the weak winter sunlight. "Got some business to discuss." "State." "Your business, then," Brandon replied evenly, his rifle balanced across his knees as he sat in his porch chair. The sheriff's face hardened. "Those Indians you're harboring, they need to clear out. Today. This here's my property," Brandon said. "Paid for legal and proper. Who I share it with ain't your concern." "It's everybody's concern when a white man takes up with savages," one deputy spat. Brandon's finger moved closer to his rifle's trigger. "Mind your tongue in front of my home." Inside, he could hear Brindle growling low. Through the window, he knew Chloe would be holding Nate close, keeping him quiet and still. The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle. "You're making a mistake, Boone. These mountains ain't kind to folks who don't know their place. Be ashamed if something happened to that fine cabin of yours. That sounds mighty close to a threat, Sheriff." Brandon's voice was quiet but carried clearly in the cold air. "Take it however you want." The sheriff gathered his reins. "But mark my words, you'll regret sheltering savages, one way or another." Brandon remained seated, rifle ready, as the 3 men turned their horses and rode away. Only when they disappeared around the bend did he lower his weapon. His hands were steady, but anger burned in his chest at their threats and cruel words. Inside, Chloe stood by the fire, her face composed but eyes worried. Nate clung to her skirts while Brindle pressed against his legs, still growling softly. "It's all right," Brandon told them, setting his rifle in its place by the door. "Ain't nobody running you off this land. Not while I'm breathing." The storm descended without warning, thick flakes swirling past the cabin windows until the world outside disappeared into white. Wind howled through the mountain passes, driving snow into deep drifts against the cabin walls. Brandon stoked the fire higher, grateful for the cords of wood they had split and stacked inside. "Might be stuck her a spell," he said, watching. Nate pressed his nose against the cold window glass. The boy's breath left foggy circles that quickly faded. Chloe nodded, stirring a pot of beans hanging over the fire. "The old ones say when snow falls this thick, it's time for stories and rest." Brindle lay curled by the hearth, his tail thumping occasionally against the floorboards. The dog's usual unease seemed forgotten in the comfort of their shared warmth. As evening approached and the storm showed no signs of letting up, Brandon remembered the tin box they had found. He retrieved it from the shelf where he had stored it, brushing off dust and sitting at the rough-hewn table. The oilskin wrapping crackled as he carefully unwound it. "What's in there?" Nate asked, abandoning his window watch to peer at the box. Brandon lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of papers, yellowed but preserved by their careful wrapping. He began sorting through them, letters written in a careful hand, receipts for lumber and supplies, and at the bottom, a document that made his breath catch. "Chloe," he called softly, "I reckon you ought to see this." She came to stand behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. The lamplight caught the official letterhead of the United States government, the elaborate signatures and seals still clear after all these years. Below the formal language was a name, her father's name, and a deed granting him clear rights to the land where their cabin now stood. Chloe's hand trembled as she reached for the paper. She held it gently, as if it might crumble to dust, and began to read. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled silently down her cheeks. "Papa said they took everything," she whispered. "But he never stopped believing the truth would surface someday." Brandon stood and pulled another chair close. "This here's proof. Legal proof that this land was granted to your family." Nate pressed against his sister's side, looking worried. At her tears, she pulled him close with one arm, still holding the deed with her other hand. "I'll keep it safe," Brandon promised. "Ain't nobody can deny your claim with this paper to back it up." They stored the deed carefully back in its tin box, wrapping it thoroughly against moisture. Brandon placed it high on a shelf, away from the damp floor and winter's chill. The storm raged for 3 days before finally breaking. When the sky cleared, Brandon saddled Brindle and rode into town, the precious deed secured inside his coat. The streets were still thick with churned snow and mud as he tied his horse outside the land office. The agent looked up with a practiced smile that quickly faded when Brandon slapped the deed onto his desk. "Care to explain this?" Brandon asked. Quietly, the agent barely glanced at the paper. "Old Indian deed? Worthless now. Times have changed. This here's got government seals, official signatures. Ain't nothing changed about that. Look, Boone." The agent leaned back, adjusting his vest. "Even if this was valid once, which I doubt, that family abandoned the property. You paid good money for it. Why cause trouble over ancient history?" Brandon planted both hands on the desk and leaned forward. "They didn't abandon nothing. They were driven out. And you knew it when you sold me that cabin." "Prove it," the agent sneered. "That paper is not worth the ink it's printed with. Now get out before I call the sheriff." Brandon straightened slowly. "You do that. Call him. We'll see what the circuit judge has to say about this deed when he comes through." He left the agent sputtering denials, mounting Brindle for the ride home. The sun was setting by the time he reached the cabin, painting the snow-covered mountains. In shades of pink and gold through the window, he saw lamplight glowing. When he stepped inside, he found Chloe and Nate seated at the table, a Bible open between them. Chloe's finger moved slowly across the page as Nate sounded out words carefully. "Do, Lord, is my shepherd." The boy read haltingly. Something in Brandon's chest tightened at the sight. He hung his coat quietly, not wanting to interrupt the lesson. But Nate looked up with a bright smile. "Brandon, come help me read." He joined them at the table, pulling his chair close. Together they read the familiar psalm, helping Nate with the harder words. When they finished, Chloe bowed her head. "Shall we pray?" she asked softly. Brandon nodded, taking Nate's small hand in his right and Chloe's work-roughened one in his left. In the warm lamplight, their shadows merged on the cabin wall as Chloe's voice rose in both English and Apache, asking for strength and guidance in the days ahead. The mountain winter settled into a gentle rhythm as January eased toward February. Morning frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows, while inside, warmth and routine brought a sense of peace Brandon hadn't known in years. He and Chloe fell into an easy partnership, their days filled with the steady work of survival. In the lean-to behind the cabin, they hung strips of venison to dry into jerky, the meat darkening slowly in the cold air. The rich, salty smell drew Brindle to nose hopefully around their feet as they worked. "Patience," Chloe would tell the dog with a laugh, though she sometimes slipped him a small piece when she thought. Brandon wasn't looking. The broken fence line that marked the cabin's boundary needed constant attention. Brandon showed Chloe how to splice wire and set posts, their breath clouding in the winter air as they worked side by side. Her quick hands soon matched his skill, and they spoke little, comfortable in shared silence. Nate transformed the quiet cabin with his boundless energy. He raced through the snow with Brindle, their tracks crisscrossing the yard as they chased squirrels that chattered and fled up pine trees. The boys' laughter rang clear in the crisp air, and even Brandon found himself smiling more often than not. "Your dog ain't much of a squirrel hunter," Nate declared one afternoon, flopping down by the fire after another failed chase. "That's 'cause he's busy watching over you instead," Brandon replied, ruffling the boy's hair as he passed. The cabin itself seemed to shed its melancholy. Chloe hung fresh curtains at the windows, and the rooms filled with the sense of cooking and pine smoke. Even the cellar lost its forbidding air as they stored their preserved food on its shelves. Brindle no longer growled at the trapdoor. Each Sunday, they hitched the wagon for the ride to church. Brandon sat tall on the bench seat, Chloe beside him and Nate between them, wrapped in blankets against the cold. He refused to hide their arrangement or apologize for it, but the welcome they'd initially received grew colder with each passing week. Women who had once smiled now turned away. Men who had tipped their hats to Brandon now crossed to the other side of the street. After one service, Brandon overheard Wilson Parker, a respected rancher, speaking to another man by the hitching post. "Shame about Boone," Parker said, loud enough to carry. "Living with savages like that. Man's disgracing himself and this whole town." Brandon's hands tightened on the wagon reins, but he felt Chloe's gentle touch on his arm. "Their words can't hurt us," she said softly. "We know what's true." That evening, as snow began to fall outside, they gathered around the table for supper. The lamplight cast a warm glow over bowls of rabbit stew and fresh bread. Nate had just finished saying grace when Chloe spoke thoughtfully. "My father used to say something that I've been remembering lately," she said, breaking off a piece of bread. "He believed true peace would come when neighbors learned to pray together. Not just in the same church building, but truly together, seeing each other as God's children." Brandon stirred his stew, considering her words. He thought of the townspeople's cold shoulders, of Parker's sneering comment, but he also thought of the pastor's steady gaze, of the few congregation members who still nodded greeting, of the quiet strength in Chloe's prayers. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," he said finally. "He was," she replied, her eyes distant with memory. "He never lost hope, even when others did." Brandon watched her across the table, noting how the lamplight softened her features, how gentle she was with Nate, how her presence had transformed his lonely cabin into something that felt like home. The thought startled him, and he quickly looked away, fighting the warmth spreading in his chest. Later, after Nate had fallen asleep by the fire and Brindle curled protectively at his feet, Brandon stood at the window. The snow fell steadily, each flake catching the lamplight as it passed. Behind him, Chloe hummed softly as she mended one of Nate's shirts. The cabin glowed like a beacon in the darkness, its walls now holding laughter instead of secrets, hope instead of grief. Brandon realized with sudden clarity that he hadn't thought of it as the ghost cabin in weeks. Whatever shadows had haunted, it seemed to have retreated before Chloe's quiet strength and Nate's innocent joy. He turned from the window to watch them, the boy sleeping peacefully, the dog standing guard, Chloe's needle flashing in the lamplight. Something inside him ached with a familiar fear of loss, but he couldn't help the smile that tugged at his mouth. For now, at least they had found peace within these walls, whatever storms gathered beyond them. The first light of dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in gentle pink when Brandon heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Brindle's warning bark jolted him from sleep. Through frosted windows, he saw a group of riders emerging from the morning mist. The sheriff, leading a pack of deputies and men in railroad company coats. His heart pounding, Brandon grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. Behind him, Chloe appeared in the doorway, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The boy pressed close to her side. "What do they want?" Nate whispered, but Brandon had no chance to answer before the sheriff's voice boomed across the yard. "Brandon!" "Boone!" The sheriff reined his horse to a stop, snow flying. "This property is hereby seized for railroad right-of-way. Clear out now, and we won't have trouble." Brandon's grip tightened on his rifle. "This land ain't for sale, Sheriff. And I got proof it belongs to these folk here." He reached slowly into his coat, withdrawing the deed they'd found. "Government-signed papers, legal as they come." The sheriff spat into the snow. "That worthless scrap? Ain't worth the paper it's written on." He nodded to his deputies. "Clear them out." Two men dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. Brandon raised his rifle. "Don't take another step. You willing to die for these savages, Boone?" The sheriff's voice dripped contempt, or maybe spend years in territorial prison. Before Brandon could answer, more deputies circled behind the cabin. One grabbed his rifle barrel, yanking it aside. Another slammed into him from behind. Brandon struggled, but a third deputy joined the fight. They wrestled him to his knees. "In the snow. No." Chloe's cry split the air as deputies stormed the porch. Brindle launched himself at the nearest man, teeth bared. The deputy's boot caught him mid-leap, sending him yelping into a snowbank. The dog scrambled up, limping but still growling. "Leave them be." Brandon fought against the hands holding him, watching helplessly as deputies dragged Chloe and Nate from the doorway. The boy thrashed and kicked while Chloe tried to reach for him. "Please," she begged. "He's just a child." The sheriff dismounted slowly, boots squeaking in the powder. He approached Brandon, drawing his revolver. "Should have minded your own business. Boone, should have stuck to your own kind." The pistol barrel swung up, then crashed down against Brandon's temple. Pain exploded through his skull. He slumped forward into the snow, blood streaming hot down his face. Through blurring vision, he watched deputies force Chloe and Nate onto horses. The boy's terrified sobs cut through the morning air like knife blades. Chloe kept calling his name, trying to calm him even as tears froze on her own cheeks. "Get them to town," the sheriff ordered. "I'll see they're escorted to the reservation where they belong." Hooves thundered past as the riders departed, taking with them the family that had brought the cabin back to life. Brandon tried to push himself up, but pain sent him reeling back into the blood-stained snow. Beside him, Brindle whined and licked his face. The sudden silence pressed in like a physical weight. No more laughter echoing from the yard. No more hymns sung soft and sweet in two languages. No more prayers shared around the table. Just the wind keening through empty rooms. And Brindle's worried WHIMPER. Brandon lay there as the sun climbed higher, fury and grief warring in his chest. Family he'd sworn to protect was gone. The home they built together stood silent as a tomb. But worse than the physical pain was the knowledge that he'd failed them, failed to keep his word, failed to stand against injustice, failed to be the man they'd believed him to be. Brindle nudged his shoulder insistently. With tremendous effort, Brandon pushed himself to his knees. Blood dripped steadily from the gash on his temple, staining the snow crimson. His vision swam, but determination began to burn through the haze of pain. The cabin door swung empty on its hinges. Inside, The fire had died to embers. Nate's wooden carvings lay scattered where he dropped them. Chloe's mending sat abandoned by her chair. The sight of their interrupted lives sent a wave of rage through Brandon's chest. He'd lost one family to nature's cruel whims. He wouldn't lose another to man's cruelty. Not while he drew breath. Night crept over the mountain, bringing bitter cold that seeped through the cabin's walls. Brandon hadn't moved from his spot by the hearth since dragging himself inside hours ago. The fire had long since died, leaving only gray ashes and an occasional ember that winked like a fading star. His temple throbbed where the sheriff's pistol had struck, and dried blood crackled in his beard. Brindle pressed close against Brandon's side, sharing what warmth he could. The dog's rough fur served as both blanket and comfort through the endless dark hours. Every so often, Brindle would whimper softly, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting Chloe and Nate to return at any moment. Brandon's thoughts wandered through memories of the past weeks. Nate's laughter as he learned to whittle. Chloe's gentle voice singing hymns in two tongues. The way the cabin had transformed from a hollow shell into a true home. The silence now felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. "Should have done more," he whispered into the darkness. Brindle's tail thumped once against the floorboards in response. The night stretched endlessly. Wind moaned through the gaps in the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called out. Brandon dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with the sound of Nate's terrified cries and the sight of Chloe's tears freezing on her cheeks, dawn as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. Brandon's stiff joints protested as he pushed himself to his knees. The movement sent fresh pain shooting through his head, but he ignored it. Something his late wife Sarah had told him long ago echoed in his mind. True courage ain't about being stronger than the other fellow. It's about choosing mercy when you could choose hate. "Lord," Brandon whispered, his voice rough from disuse, "I ain't been much for praying lately. But these folk need your help. Show me the way to make this right." As if in answer, Brindle suddenly leaped up and trotted to the cellar door. The dog's claws scraped insistently against the wood as he had so many times before. Brandon watched him for a moment, then slowly rose to his feet. "What you got there, boy?" He lifted the trapdoor, grimacing at the effort. Brindle immediately bounded down the ladder, heading straight for a dark corner they hadn't fully explored. The dog began digging frantically at the packed earth floor. Brandon grabbed a lantern and carefully made his way down. In the flickering light, he saw something pale emerging from the dirt where Brindle scratched, the corner of an oilskin packet, similar to the one that had held the first deed. With trembling fingers, Brandon brushed away the soil and lifted the bundle. Inside, he found more documents, these bearing official government seals and signatures. His eyes widened as he read. Treaties, land grants, and letters acknowledging the tribe's rights to the territory. The papers were dated years before the railroad's claims. "Good boy," Brandon whispered, scratching Brindle's ears. The dog's tail wagged proudly. The Lord does work in mysterious ways. Moving with fresh purpose despite his aching body, Brandon gathered the documents and climbed back up. He carefully tucked them into his coat, then strapped on his gumbelt. The weight of the revolver felt different now, not a threat, but a last resort. "We ain't going in looking for a fight," he told Brindle as he saddled his horse. "But we ain't backing down neither." The morning air bit sharp and clean as Brandon swung into the saddle. His head swam for a moment, but he steadied himself. Brindle fell into step beside the horse as they started down the trail toward town, their tracks marking the fresh snow. Brandon's heart pounded harder with each step closer to town. He touched the papers inside his coat, drawing strength from their presence. Sarah's words echoed again in his mind. Choose mercy, even when hate would be easier. He wasn't riding to seek revenge. but justice, and there was a world of difference between the two. The sun climbed higher as they made their slow way down the mountain. Brandon's bruised body protested every hoofbeat, but determination drove him forward. Brindle trotted faithfully alongside, alert for any threat. Together they followed the trail where Chloe and Nate had been taken, their purpose as clear as the tracks in the snow. Brandon lifted his eyes to the town that lay ahead, his jaw set with quiet resolve. He wasn't just fighting for a cabin anymore, but for the very meaning of home, family, and right. With God's help and these documents, he would see justice done, not through violence, but through truth. The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Brandon guided his horse toward the white-painted church. His body ached from yesterday's beating, but determination straightened his spine. The brass bell in the steeple rang out, its clear tone carrying across the quiet town. Brindle padded faithfully beside him, alert and watchful. Townsfolk in their Sunday best climbed the wooden steps, some pausing to stare at Brandon's bruised face. He could hear their whispers, see them nudging each other and pointing. His horses' hooves echoed against the packed earth as he drew to a halt before the church steps. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. The sheriff sat in a front pew, one hand resting casually on his gumbelt. Beside him, Chloe and her brother huddled close together, their faces drawn with worry. The boy's eyes lit up when he spotted Brindle through the open door, but the sheriff's stern glance kept him still. Brandon straightened his coat, feeling the weight of the treaty papers against his chest. The congregation fell silent as he strode down the center aisle, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding his gaze. Others watched with open curiosity. The circuit preacher stood at his pulpit, Bible open before him. He paused in his reading as Brandon approached, noting the determined set of the mountain man's jaw. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," Brandon said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "that there's a matter of truth that needs speaking here today." The preacher studied Brandon's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Truth is always welcome in God's house, Mr. Boone." Brandon reached into his coat and withdrew the oilskin packet. His hands were steady as he unfolded the documents, the paper crackling in the silence. The sheriff started to rise, but the preacher's stern look kept him seated. These papers, Brandon held them high so all could see the official seals, were hidden away in that cabin. Their government deeds and treaties, signed and witnessed proper, granting ownership of that land to Chloe's father and his people. Murmurs rippled through the congregation as Brandon began to read. His voice grew stronger with each word, the formal language of law and treaty filling the sacred space. The documents detailed the original land grant, complete with signatures from territorial officials and Indian agents. The sheriff's face darkened. "Those papers ain't worth the ink they're written with," he sneered, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. The preacher stepped down from his pulpit and approached Brandon, hand extended. "May I see those, sir?" Brandon passed them over carefully. The preacher adjusted his spectacles and studied each page, his expression growing grave. The congregation waited in tense silence. Finally, the preacher looked up, his gaze sweeping across the gathered faces. "These documents appear entirely legitimate. The seals and signatures are genuine. The truth they reveal cannot be denied. This is nonsense." The sheriff surged to his feet, his face flushed. "You can't seriously believe. We believe in justice." "Sheriff," a voice called from the back pews. Others joined in, their voices rising in anger and shame. "Ain't right. What was done? The land was theirs fair and square. Lord have mercy on us for standing silent." Brandon's eyes met Chloe's across the church. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her brother's hand. The boy was grinning, hope replacing fear in his young face. The preacher raised his hands for quiet. My friends, we have a sacred duty to right this wrong. The Lord commands us to deal justly and to love mercy. These papers prove what was done in darkness. Now, in his light, we must make it right. More voices joined the chorus of agreement. The sheriff looked around wildly, seeing his support crumbling. His hand twitched toward his gun, but he thought better of it. Surrounded by the fiery would bend by the toward his gun, but he thought better of it. Surrounded by the fire of it. Righteous anger of his neighbors. Brandon stepped forward, his voice firm but free of triumph. The cabin and land belonged to Chloe and her brother. That's the truth of it, plain as scripture. The congregation stirred, and several men stood up, moving to flank Brandon. Their message was clear. Justice would be served today, with or without the sheriff's cooperation. Chloe rose slowly, drawing her brother up beside her. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. We thank you all. My father always believed peace would come through truth and prayer. Today proves his faith was not in vain. The morning sun streamed brighter through the windows, as if heaven itself approved. The preacher held the documents reverently, like a second Bible, while the congregation began to move, surrounding Chloe and her brother with gestures of support and reconciliation. Sheriff stood alone now, his authority stripped away by the power of truth and justice. Brandon watched him, remembering Sarah's words about choosing mercy over hate. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest victory came not from defeating an enemy, but from letting truth speak for itself. The church erupted into chaos. Ranchers, who had known Brandon from his early days as a hand shot to their feet, their weathered faces set with determination. Tom McKinnon, whose spread bordered the mountain trails, stepped forward first. Sheriff, you let those two go right now, he demanded, his voice hard as iron. We've stood by too long while you played loose with the law. Other ranchers moved to stand beside him. The Wilsons, old Jake Peterson, and the Miller brothers. They formed a wall of resolve between the sheriff and his intended prisoners. The deputies exchanged uncertain glances, their hands hovering near their gun belts. The circuit preacher's voice cut through the tension like a bell. The Lord calls us to uphold justice and show mercy, he proclaimed, holding the treaty papers. Hi, these documents prove what is right and lawful. Will we be faithful to his commands or turn our backs on decency? Brandon watched as the deputies' faces changed. Young Billy Rogers was the first to step back, removing his hand from his revolver. The others followed suit, their badges suddenly seeming to weigh heavy on their chests. They knew they'd been enforcing wrong, not right. The railroad men who had accompanied the sheriff began edging toward the door. The tallest one, wearing an expensive Eastern suit, whispered urgently to his companions. They slipped out quickly, unwilling to have their names connected to this scandal that would surely reach territorial papers. This is outrageous, the sheriff bellowed, his face flushing deeper red, but his words rang hollow in the sacred space. The congregation that had once feared him now stood straight-backed, shame transformed to righteous purpose, with no one left. To back his play, the sheriff stormed down the aisle, spurs jingling angrily. The heavy church door slammed behind him, and a collective breath of relief swept through the gathering. Chloe broke free from the pew, her brother close behind. She ran to Brandon, tears streaming down her face as she gripped his arms. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for believing us. The boy wrapped his arms around Brandon's waist, and Brindle pressed against his legs, forming a circle of found family in the church's warm light. One by one, townsfolk approached them. Martha Wilson brought forth a loaf of fresh bread. Old Jake Peterson offered help fixing the cabin's roof. The mercantile owner promised fair prices and credit at his store. We were wrong, they said, in different words but with the same heart. We let fear rule instead of faith. Please forgive us." The preacher raised his hands, calling them to prayer. "Let us ask God's forgiveness and guidance," he said solemnly. "Let us pray for healing in our community and our hearts." Heads bowed throughout the church. Brandon felt Chloe's hand slip into his as the preacher's words washed over them. "Lord, help us rebuild what hatred broke. Help us remember we are all your children, bound together in your love." For the first time since arriving in town, Brandon felt hope bloom fully in his chest. He saw it reflected in the faces around him, the possibility of true community, of neighbors standing together for what was right. The morning sun streamed through the windows, touching each bowed head with gold, blessing this moment of renewal. The evening sun painted long shadows across the snow as Brandon, Chloe, and her brother made their way back to the cabin. Brindle trotted ahead, his tail wagging with newfound energy. The sight of smoke curling from their chimney welcomed them home like an old friend. Inside, Brandon knelt at the hearth, carefully arranging kindling beneath dry logs. Soon, flames crackled to life, spreading warmth throughout the room. Golden light danced across the weathered walls that had witnessed so much sorrow and now promised joy. Chloe stood before the stone mantle, the precious deed in her hands. With reverence, she placed it above the fireplace, smoothing its worn edges. "This paper," she said softly, "it belongs to all who seek shelter here in peace." Her eyes met Brandon's, sharing an understanding deeper than words. Brandon bowed his head, emotion catching in his throat. Just months ago, he'd been a lonely trapper seeking 4 walls to call his own. Now, watching Chloe's brother chase Brindle playfully around the table, he realized God had given him so much more. A family. They gathered around the table as evening settled in. Steam rose from bowls of rich stew, and fresh bread filled the cabin with its homey scent. Chloe's brother told stories that made them all laugh, while Brindle dozed contentedly at their feet, his chin resting on Brandon's boot. Outside, snow began falling softly, each flake catching the lamplight through the windows. But inside, warmth and love had chased away every shadow. The cabin seemed to glow from within, transformed from a place that once held grief into a beacon of hope for all who passed by. When they joined hands for evening prayer, Brandon's heart was full. Chloe's quiet words of thanksgiving echoed his own gratitude for this unexpected blessing. Not just a home, but a family bound together by faith, justice, and love. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.